Resuming debate, the honourable member for Vancouver East.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I have to say, I feel all fired up after hearing the member from Nanaimo Cowichan. She gave a great summary of how the NDP feels about this bill and why we're opposed to it. So thank you very much to the member from Nanaimo Cowichan. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise in the House today to speak to Bill C-24, which of course is the free trade agreement between Canada and Panama. And I want to begin my remarks by noting that, of course, this is not the first time that we've dealt with this bill and not the first time that we've fought this bill. It did come to the House in the last Parliament, in the 40th Parliament, and in fact it was passed at second reading. It went to committee and there were many witnesses that were called, and it started to go through a clause by clause and was finally concluded in December of 2010, but then died on the order paper at the dissolution of the 40th Parliament. So we know the legislation was reintroduced in November of last year, so we do get to have another kick at the can, so to speak. And I just want to outline why we on the NDP side feel so strongly opposed to this bill and other trade agreements that we feel are really trade agreements that are exploitative, that are narrow, and that, as the member previously just said, do not take a comprehensive approach. And I want to, first of all, thank the Labour movement, the Canadian Labour Congress. There have been individual unions who have paid enormous attention to some of these bills. I remember the Canada-Colombia Free Trade Agreement, which we opposed vigorously in this House for several years, and so did the Labour movement. And we did that because we really feel that these trade agreements lay down a regime. It continues the NAFTA-style agreement, that does not respect the integrity of human rights, does not respect or even understand what needs to be addressed in the signing country and what Canada's role is in these agreements. I think sometimes the Conservative government think that nobody's watching, you know, and these kind of innocuous bills, these trade agreements that are kind of boring, they're kind of technical, that they'll just slip through. Well, the fact is, many people pay attention to these particular trade agreements, whether it's the Council of Canadians, the Canadian Labour Congress, individual unions. I know the steelworkers did an incredible amount of work on the Canada-Colombia trade agreement because of their concern about labour rights and human rights in Colombia, but also in local communities. In my own community in East Vancouver, there's a whole movement for what's called fair trade. Commercial Drive is known as the first community in Canada that has a fair trade retail district where stores are encouraged to both to purchase for their own use but also to sell retail to customers products that have been obtained through fair trade practices that are certified, that are transparent, and that are healthy. And so it actually is a movement. It's a consumer movement. And it's partly in reaction to these massive trade agreements that are now being sent through this House, not just by Canada, but also by other governments. And so I do think it's important to note that there is an incredible amount of interest in the whole notion of fair trade that respects the rights and the environment and social justice in the country that we're trading with, and also respects the need for jobs here in Canada. So this is a pretty large issue, and if they think they're just sort of sliding it through with no one watching, then I think that is clearly not the case. Now, Mr. Speaker, with the bill in front of us, when it did go to committee previously, and I just want to highlight a couple of the things that we tried to do, because as the member from Nanaimo Cowichan said, in the NDP, we're not just opposing, we're actually proposing and being very proactive in putting forward amendments and trying to suggest what would actually improve a trade agreement. So I know at when it did go to the committee last year, the member from Burnaby New Westminster, who was our trade critic at the time and who did an incredible job of providing awareness about not only this particular trade agreement, but also the Canada-Colombia, he moved numerous motions to try and address some of the grievous aspects of this bill. And he particularly focused on the fact that this bill does nothing in regards to the tax haven environment that is in Panama. We heard at the committee, now I wasn't there, but I know from hearing from the member that there were many witnesses who spoke about their concerns to do with the tax haven environment in Panama, as well as the poor record on labor rights. Now the member valiantly tried to put forward amendments to address this, and it's very distressing to know that both the Conservative and Liberal members of that committee shot down these amendments. So there were attempts made at committee to make this bill, this agreement, a better agreement. And it seems to me that that's what our role, that's what our job is as legislatures. And I think it's important to note from the record that even the Canadian government has requested greater tax information transparency in Panama. And it's, again, very concerning that Panama has refused to sign a tax information exchange agreement. And in fact, this has led to the OECD to label the nation a tax haven. You know, is this the kind of place that we should be trading with? We expect transparency in our country, and even that's a struggle here, something that we're always working to ensure it actually happens. But if you're going to introduce a new agreement and you're going to conduct and develop a new relationship with a country, a trading partner, surely these are the kinds of provisions that should be front and center in that agreement. So it's very unfortunate that even though the Canadian government was requesting Panama to sign a tax information exchange agreement, there was no agreement from the other side. So that should be something that sends off a warning bell that there's a problem here. I know that the member from Burnaby New Westminster also moved a motion which would have stopped the implementation of the trade agreement until Panama agreed to sign a tax information exchange agreement. That too was defeated. He also moved amendments that would have required the Minister for International Trade to consult with labor and trade unions, as well as work with human rights experts and organizations in order to create impact assessments for the trade agreement. Now, to me, this is something that's very important. What does that mean? It means basically that you recognize that there's a serious problem, that there needs to be an ongoing evaluation, assessment, and monitoring, and that surely our minister responsible for these areas should be able to consult with labor and trade unions, as well as human rights organizations who work in this area, to know what's actually going on the ground. I mean, Mr. Speaker, we're not talking about theoretical situations. We're talking about serious human rights violations. We're talking about serious labor violations where workers don't have the right to collective agreements, where they don't have the right to strike, where their very ability and right to organize as a union is sometimes threatened and very much in jeopardy, both in a collective sense but also in a personal, individual sense. I mean, Mr. Speaker, that's a very serious situation. And so it seemed to us to be a very reasonable suggestion to put forward as an amendment that the minister, for heaven's sake, would want to know what's going on, would want to consult with the very organizations who are aware of these situations, and to be able to then have impact assessments as part of the agreement. You'd think that would have been supported. Nope, that was defeated too. The member also put forward amendments that would have protected trade union workers in Panama by offering the right to collective bargaining, as well as requiring the Minister of International Trade, as the principal representative of Canada, to consult on a regular basis with organizations in our country. That was defeated too. So, Mr. Speaker, this bill has a very sorry history. It's back before us again. We will do our utmost to defeat this bill. It should go back to the drawing board, and it should be reversed in favor of an agreement that is based on the principles of fair, sustainable and equitable trade, which builds trading relationships and partnerships with other countries, that support the principles of social justice and human rights, while also expanding, obviously, economic opportunities. That's what fair trade's about, and that's what we should be doing in this agreement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague from Vancouver East for laying out some of our sincere and legitimate concerns with this bill and the points that we have been trying to make. We've been urging the government to take into consideration some of the reasonable, and not just to consider, but to accommodate some of the reasonable concerns that we've had for this. And I'd like to focus on one comment my colleague made. Essentially, my colleague from Vancouver was making the point that a free trade agreement with Canada is not a right, it's more a privilege. And in fact, if you do, if you want to become a member of the community of free trading nations, you should be stipulating yourself to a set of standards and rules that in fact elevate the standards of wages and living conditions in your home country, and complement those high standards of wages and living conditions in the trading partner, in this case, Canada. In other words, it's us that should be rising the conditions of these countries up to our level and not allowing our standards to be pulled down to their level. It seems like a very straightforward notion in my mind, Mr. Speaker. I'd ask my colleague if that is, in fact, the basis of her objections to this agreement as it stands.
The honourable member for Vancouver East.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the member from Winnipeg Centre for his very thoughtful comments. And, this whole notion of free trade, what is the freedom about this? Well, really, it's the freedom to move capital wherever you want, without any rules, without any restrictions, with disregard to labour standards, jobs, human rights, the environment, social questions. So I think the member is entirely correct when he says that the fundamental principles here of upholding those rights as we know them in Canada, but let's remember that those rights are also based on international standards as laid out by the International Labour Organization, the right to collective bargaining, the right to speech, the right to strike. I mean, there's a whole number of conventions which, regrettably, even Canada is not a signatory to all of them, but there are conventions that lay out these very important foundation principles, and I entirely agree that trade agreements have to be seen with and negotiated within the context of that and not in isolation and removed from that.
Questions and comments? L'honorable député de Honoré.
The Honourable Member for Honoré-Mercier. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to ask my colleague about this government's vision when it comes to free trade agreements. Do you find that this government shows sincere ambition to contribute to improving the quality of life of our economic partners? Do you find in these agreements Canada's commitment to supporting these countries in improving social conditions, respecting individual collective rights, labor standards, environmental standards, or other standards? In other words, is this government trying to capitalize on the weakness of some countries in this respect? Thank you.
Honourable member for Vancouver East.
Well, I think, Mr. Speaker, one of the objections we've had is that this particular agreement is seeking to continue what we call the NAFTA model, and of course, NAFTA was the first big agreement that happened, and since the failure of the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas, the FTAA, and I know many of us were in Quebec City a number of years ago protesting that, since the failure of that agreement, and it was shot down, now we see the Canadian government seeking to have these sort of bilateral agreements, but it's still based on the NAFTA model. And so I entirely agree with the member that she's correct in the assessment of that model is very narrow. It's based on a corporate model of the flow of capital, and it does not take into consideration labor rights, social rights, human rights, the environment, other social questions, and this is why it must be rejected. So it's not that we're always told we're against trade. Who could be against trade? We're not against trade. We're in favor of free trade, of fair trade that is based on important international principles, and then we could advance good agreements that would actually benefit both countries and the workers.
Reprise de débat.